Hello and welcome back to Photoshop CS6 for web designers. In this lesson, we're going to discuss the anatomy of a Photoshop file. What makes up a Photoshop file? How is it put together? And understanding this concept is really going to help us moving forward. Now, when I think about my first days using Photoshop over a decade ago, I can't help but think about the premier graphics program of my childhood, and that is Microsoft Paint. I remember in junior high opening up Windows 3 and going into Microsoft Paint and just doodling to my heart's content. But thankfully, Photoshop is a much more robust piece of software than Microsoft Paint. With Paint, it was basically like having a digital virtual sheet of paper in front of you that you could scribble all over with a pen. You had some basic shape tools, you had some color control, but once you drew it on the stage, it was pretty much there, and you could use the eraser tool, but it worked just like a regular eraser. It'll erase everything that it touches. Photoshop, however, is much more complex than that, and I mean that in a good way. Photoshop is made up of layers. You don't have to put everything on one layer in Photoshop. In fact, this particular file is made up of dozens of layers, and some of those layers are even grouped together into folders. So in the file you see before you, you have the title, Fred's Photos. That's on one layer. You have this other piece of text, Nature Photography. That's on another layer. We have this image of mountains in Colorado. That's on another layer. And pretty much every graphic element that you see here on the stage is contained in its own layer in Photoshop. So one of the first things we really need to get familiar with is layers and the layer panel. Now over here on the right hand side of the screen, we can see the layer panels, and we can see all of the different layers and layer groups that make up this particular document. And as you can see, these layer groups, which are signified by these icons with folders on them, these are groups of layers that are labeled according to what layers are in them. So the top one here contains layers pertaining to the menu of our Photoshop document. The second layer group is labeled Logo. It contains the logo and the Nature Photography text here at the top. Then we have Popular Galleries, which are these four sections down here at the bottom. We have a folder which contains layers for the Sign Up section over here on the left, and so on and so forth. But basically the way this works is we have a background layer at the very bottom of the layer stack, and you can think of these layers as multiple transparencies that are placed one on top of the other, and each transparency has a different portion of our graphics on them. So our bottom layer here is really just a white blank background. It has nothing on it, just white. On top of that, we have a paper texture, and you can see this paper texture a little bit around the edges of our document. It's a very subtle texture, and we'll talk about how to do that. But that's what that is. That whole layer is just that paper texture. On top of that is what's called an adjustment layer. It's making an adjustment to the layers below it. So it's taking that paper layer and it's recoloring it. It's basically taking all of the tan tint out of it and just making it a more monochrome color. So if we turn that layer off by clicking on the eye icon next to it, we can see what the original layer beneath it looks like. And by applying this adjustment layer to it, we're able to basically suck all the color out of it, lighten it up a little bit, and give it the appearance that we want to give it. So we have numerous layers. Obviously, we're not going to go into each one of them just yet. We're going to build them up on our own one by one. But above the initial few layers, we have our layer groups. And our layer groups are basically just folders that contain other layers. And if we click on the triangle icon on one of these groups, we can expand that folder out to see all of the layers that are contained within that folder. And once we're done looking at those layers, we can then collapse that folder again and move on to the next one. So again, understanding how layers work is very key to understanding how to work in Photoshop. You can't get around in Photoshop without working in layers. If you try to, you're going to go crazy. It's much easier to use layers because it separates your content so that you can edit one piece of content without worrying about messing with the rest of the content on the screen. So again, it's very crucial to understand how to use layers. But again, as we work through this series and as we start building up this file from scratch, we're going to really start to understand our layers panel more and more. So hopefully that gives you a good understanding of how our Photoshop file is put together. In the next video, we're going to get started creating a brand new document that we're going to use to put together all of the graphics for our web design. So thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.